She had sent a dinner invitation to the wrong person. Just one mistaken letter. One wrong Nate. 10 minutes later, he replied saying he would come. Not Ethan, her college friend. Not the man she meant to invite. But someone else. Someone dangerous, powerful, and enigmatic. She had tried to correct the mistake. He simply told her it was already too late. He had cleared his schedule. And so, a harmless typo became the beginning of the strangest and most unforgettable love story of her life. This was not just a romance. This was the story of how a misdirected message could lead to everything. On a Wednesday afternoon in Austin, Texas, under an October sky as blue and unbroken as a sheet of glass, Emily Sanders was crouched on the floor of her tiny office, surrounded by fabric swatches, project files, and unfinished sketches. She was trying to choose between two linen samples, one a soft cream, the other slightly gray, for the living room of her new client, but her mind was nowhere near the work in front of her. For more than an hour, she had been thinking only about the upcoming weekend dinner. Not because she loved hosting or planning ahead, but because after 3 long years of delays, Ethan Monroe, her closest friend from their university days in Denver, was finally flying out to visit her in Austin. They had planned and replanned so many times, but Ethan was always busy or postponing or quietly slipping away. This time, Emily refused to give him any room to escape. The week before, she had messaged him, telling him that he had no choice, that she had already made the reservation and that it was his cue to show up. Ethan had sent back a photo of his plane ticket along with 3 laughing emojis. So today, in the middle of her chaotic workload, Emily took a moment to draft an official invitation email, perhaps overly formal, but she did not mind. She opened her contacts, typed the name Nate, which was Ethan's middle name, the one she had used for him ever since their university years. 2 names appeared, Nate M. and Nate R., an address automatically saved from a project email she had been copied on months ago. She clicked the second without checking the full surname, her mind still tangled with a supplier's earlier mistake about fabric color codes. She typed the email in less than a minute. The subject line read, "Finally coming to Austin." She wrote that she could not believe he was finally agreeing to come to Texas, told him that she had booked a table at the Peach Tortilla for Friday at 8 in the evening, described its beautiful rooftop with soft golden lights, its excellent cocktails, and its bourbon-flavored slider that might be the best in the South. She added that afterward they could go for drinks at Kitty Cohen's, and that she had many things she wanted to tell him. It had been too long. She told him to dress nicely since the place had a bit of a dress code, and she ended with how much she looked forward to seeing him. She signed it Emily and added a note saying that if he needed a place to stay, her comfortable pull-out sofa was ready for him, just like in their college days. Emily hit send at 3:46 in the afternoon. Then she rushed out with her car keys, heading to a client meeting in South Congress. She left her phone in her bag, untouched for more than 2 hours. During that time, in a luxurious office tower in West Austin, inside a conference room with glass walls overlooking the Barton Creek Hills, Nathaniel Romano, 40 years old, the chief executive officer of Romano Group, was sitting in weary silence while the head of finance reviewed the quarterly cash flow. His laptop chimed with a notification. A new email. The sender was Emily Sanders from ES Interiors Austin. The name made him pause. 6 months earlier, he had only caught a glimpse of her in the building lobby as she waited for the project manager to sign off on the penthouse design sample. She had been sitting neatly with a portfolio almost larger than her body beside her, wearing a peach-colored dress, her hair tied low, her face tilted in concentration over a sketch, her fingers adjusting the corner of the paper as though she were safeguarding something fragile. He had stopped not because she was beautiful, but because she had no idea who he was. She had looked up and smiled, a polite, genuine smile. Not the kind people reserved for the Romanos, not the kind meant for status or power, simply the courtesy one human offered another. That smile had followed him for an entire week. And now she appeared in his inbox with a dinner invitation and a lodging offer. It was, of course, a mistake. But he did not think long. He typed only a few words saying he would come and signed it Nate. He sent the email at 3:56. Then he closed his laptop, turned to his assistant and said that the rest of the afternoon should be cancelled because he had somewhere to be. Meanwhile, Emily was driving home when she remembered she had not checked her email. When she opened her inbox and saw a response from Nate R., she froze. Her college friend never replied that quickly. She looked at the email address more closely. Her heart dropped. Nate R. was not Nate Monroe. He was Nate Romano, the head of Romano Group, a man she had never met directly, only worked with through his assistant. The man to whom she had just sent a dinner invitation along with an invitation to stay the night. And now, he had confirmed he would come. If you are still listening at this point, perhaps you are a little like Emily, unable to pull yourself away just when things start to become intriguing. Before we move on to the next part of the story, do not forget to tap subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with someone in your life who appreciates tender, emotional stories like this one. Where are you listening from? Share the name of your city or your country below. We would love to see how far Emily's story has traveled across the map. And now, let us return to the journey that began with nothing more than a single mistaken click. Emily pulled into the parking lot behind her apartment building, her hands still gripping the steering wheel, her mind spinning and her heartbeat racing as if she had just finished a sprint. She could not believe what had just happened. She had sent a dinner invitation to one of the most powerful men in Austin, and worse still, he had answered, decisively, without hesitation, without clarifying, without mistaking her intention. He would come. She fumbled for her phone, checking again to be sure. The email address stood out plainly, nate.romano@romgroup.com. There was no denying it. It was him. Nathaniel Romano. Romano Group. The man business magazines called the real estate king of the South. The man whose name she had heard countless times while working with the project team on the luxury tower his company owned. And now he believed she was inviting him to dinner. Not just dinner, but also offering him a place to stay. She wished she could disappear. When she reached her 17th floor apartment, Emily tossed her bag onto the sofa and hurried to open her laptop. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed her reply. She had to fix this. Immediately. She took a breath and typed each word with careful precision, aiming for a tone that was professional, yet clearly apologetic. She wrote to Nathaniel Romano with the subject line, "A mistaken invitation." She explained that she was deeply sorry for the previous email, that it had been sent in error and was meant for an old friend who shared the same name, and she asked him to disregard the invitation, apologizing sincerely for any misunderstanding. She reread the message 3 times, adjusting punctuation, before finally pressing send. Then she collapsed onto the sofa, eyes closed, a hand pressed to her forehead. Everything would be fine. He would read it, recognize the innocent mistake, and simply move on. Perhaps he would smile slightly, delete the email and return to the financial meeting or the multi-million-dollar deal that surely required his attention. She would never have to see him. It would fade as though it had never happened. An hour later, while she reheated yesterday's takeout pasta and felt her breath returning to normal, her computer chimed again. A new email. From Nathaniel Romano. She dropped her spoon and rushed to her desk. She opened it. A single brief line waited for her, without a subject, without a greeting, only the words that it was already too late, that he had cleared his schedule and that he would see her on Friday at 8 in the evening at the Peach Tortilla. Signed, Nate. Emily stood frozen. She read it again and again, hoping she had misinterpreted something. But no. He was confirming once more that he would come, even though she had explained it was a mistake, even though she had apologized. He was still coming, without a hint of doubt or concern. The simplicity of his words, concise yet weighted, pressed against her like a quiet command. A decision already made. She stood abruptly and began pacing through her apartment. This could not happen. She could not let it happen. And yet, somewhere deep inside her, in a place she did not want to name, she was not entirely opposed. There was something in the steadiness of his response that left her both unsettled and curious. Who was this man who could dismiss her refusal so completely? Who reacted to a mistaken invitation by clearing his schedule to have dinner with a woman he had never met? She knew she should be angry, should feel bothered, should send another email to firmly restate her boundaries. Instead, she sat down, opened her phone and typed a message to Ethan, telling him that something unexpected had come up and asking if he could arrive Saturday morning instead of Friday night. Ethan replied almost immediately, saying it was no problem, that his flight had been delayed and he would land in Austin at 10 in the morning and would see her after brunch. Emily set the phone down. Everything suddenly felt real. This was truly happening. She had sent a message to the wrong man, and instead of ignoring it, the recipient had accepted it as though it had been written for him alone. Friday, 8 in the evening, at one of her favorite restaurants in Austin. She exhaled, stood up, and looked at herself in the mirror. This was no longer an accident. It was a choice. And the most frightening part was that she was no longer sure she wanted to step back. Friday arrived faster than she expected. The entire day she could hardly focus on anything. She sent her assistant to the site survey at Zilker Park because she knew that if she went herself, she would choose the wrong color palette without realizing it. She rewrote the guest bedroom design 3 times before returning to her original layout. She checked her email at least 12 times, even though she knew nothing new would appear. Nate Romano sent no further messages after the last one. No confirmation, no suggestion, no question. Only the single sentence saying he had cleared his schedule and would meet her at the Peached Tortilla. Then silence. Silence so complete it made her feel as though she were stepping towards something she could not see clearly, something she could neither predict nor touch. At 7 in the evening she stood before the mirror in her bedroom, looking at herself. A black dress falling just below her knees, with a subtle V neckline and 3/4 sleeves. Graceful without being too bold. She had tried 3 other outfits before returning to this one. Not too showy, not too casual. The kind of dress she would wear to a professional dinner, but hoping the man across the table might see her in another light. She tied her hair low, brushed her eyes lightly, and painted her lips a deep red. The nude heels came last. And when the clock reached 7:40, she left her apartment. When Emily arrived at the Peach Tortilla, she was led to the reserved table for 2 tucked in a corner of the balcony, a spot where she could see the glow of the streetlights below and the distant line of trees swaying gently in the cool October breeze. The air carried the warmth of fragrant food, and soft jazz floated from the overhead speakers. The server bowed slightly and told her that Mr. Romano had called ahead and that everything was ready. Emily nodded, swallowed hard, and took her seat, her heart beating far too quickly for any reasonable explanation. She pulled out her phone and glanced at her last message with Ethan. Brunch tomorrow morning. Definitely, do not worry. Enjoy your evening. She put the phone away, drew a steadying breath, and tried to calm the nervous rhythm inside her chest. She reminded herself that this was only a dinner, a brief meeting, a misunderstanding that would soon be cleared. Perhaps they would exchange a few words, laugh it off, and each return home without complication. But 5 minutes later, all such assumptions dissolved. He arrived, exactly at 8 in the evening, not a single minute late. Nathaniel Romano stepped into the outdoor space as though it had been designed with him in mind. He wore a charcoal gray suit without a tie, his white shirt open at the top, 2 buttons, his tall frame composed, his shoulders broad, his walk unhurried but assured. The warm glow of the string lights brushed across his neatly styled hair, giving it a faintly unruly edge. When his eyes found her, he paused for a quiet beat before offering a smile, not the polite, distant kind, but the smile of someone who had already imagined this moment before it happened. Emily stood automatically. She greeted him as Mr. Romano, her voice catching slightly, but he corrected her gently, telling her to call him Nate, his gaze never leaving hers. He pulled out her chair before taking the seat across from her. The server appeared almost immediately, asking if he wanted the usual. Nate nodded and then asked what kind of wine she would like to try, looking at her with an ease that felt as though they had shared many dinners before this one. She agreed awkwardly to whatever he chose. The red wine arrived soon after, poured into crystal glasses. Emily lifted hers but did not drink. She felt as though she had stepped into a game where the other player had already moved several steps ahead. She began with an apology, telling him the email was not meant for him. He said he knew, yet pointed out she had still sent it. She explained that she had clicked the wrong name, that it was meant for an old friend who shared the same one. He replied that he understood, but when he saw the message, he thought perhaps it was a kind of fate. She nearly laughed at the word, asking if he did not believe in correcting mistakes. He told her he did, but there were some mistakes worth following to see where they might lead. His words made her pause. For a moment she simply looked into his eyes, deep and steady, and she sensed he meant what he said. For the first time since the email had left her outbox, Emily no longer felt she was the one controlling the situation, and strangely, she did not feel afraid. She felt herself drifting towards something she could not yet define, something she could not look away from. The evening had only just begun, and nothing she had imagined beforehand still held true. Dinner unfolded in a rhythm that felt oddly familiar, yet entirely new. Emily had expected the night to end quickly, politely, perhaps with a faint shadow of embarrassment. Instead, within the first 15 minutes, every small intention she had to resist simply melted away. Nate did not ask the predictable questions she was used to hearing at client dinners or networking events. He did not speak of money or business or even of himself. He asked about small things few people noticed, why she chose Austin to build her career, where she first designed a space and what it felt like to see something rise from her drawings into a finished place where people actually lived. Emily hesitated at first, but soon she found herself smiling more, speaking more freely. She told him about a small hotel in South Congress, where the owner had given her only 2 weeks and a painfully tight budget to make the place feel alive. She told him about the first apartment she rented when she moved to Austin, where the bathroom drain clogged constantly, yet she had felt strangely safe there. And Nate listened. He did not interrupt. He did not seem politely patient. He truly listened, his eyes holding her words as though each one carried weight. Their food arrived. Slow smoked beef with honey glaze, roasted vegetables, and a side of Asian-style fried rice she had never ordered before, but now found uncannily perfect. Nate had not looked at the menu. He had simply told the server the same as always. She lifted an eyebrow, asking if he came often. Only when he wanted to feel like a normal person, he said, sipping his wine. The honesty in his voice settled over her quietly. In that moment, she sensed a large shadow behind the man sitting across from her, and strangely, she felt no fear of it. When they finished dessert, a smooth caramel cheesecake, she realized nearly 2 hours had passed. She had not checked the time, had not looked at her phone, had not felt a flicker of boredom. Only conversation, steady glances, and the sense that the world beyond their table had drifted somewhere far away. When they stepped out of the restaurant, the cool night air moved through her hair. Nate stood beside her, not touching her, not drawing closer, yet his presence thickened the space around them. She meant to say goodnight, to end things neatly, but he spoke first, his voice low and clear, telling her he wanted to see her again. She hesitated, asking whether he wanted that, even knowing everything had begun with a mistake. He told her that because it began with a mistake, he did not wish to stop now that everything felt right. He said she might still feel uncertain and that he would not push her, but if she agreed, he would like to take her for a walk on Sunday afternoon. No events, no wine, just a park, coffee and conversation, like real people. She smiled, just a small curve of her lips, but it softened the long, exhausting day. She teased him lightly, asking if he often used mistakes as invitations. Never, he said quietly. She was unlike anyone he had met. Emily did not answer right away. She simply looked at him for a long moment before nodding gently. "Sunday afternoon," she said. "Send me the place." Nate nodded, a quiet spark of relief and triumph in his eyes, and promised he would not be late. She walked toward her car, her heartbeat staggering out of rhythm. When she opened the door and slipped inside, her hands were still trembling. She wondered what had just happened, how an evening born from an error had ended with a sincere promise. And the most unsettling truth was that she had no desire at all to refuse it. The next morning, brunch with Ethan passed in a blur. She hugged him, listened to his stories about Denver, and laughed at the right moments. But her mind remained drifted, tethered to the image of a man standing under the string lights the night before. Ethan didn't ask, but he looked at her curiously once or twice, sensing a shift she wasn't ready to explain. By the time he left for his hotel, Emily felt exhausted, not from the social interaction, but from the effort of pretending her world hadn't just tilted on its axis. On Sunday afternoon, Emily arrived at the park on time, but Nate was already there. He stood leaning against the wooden railing overlooking the lake, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. The sleeves of his white shirt neatly rolled, his hair slightly tousled as though he had just stepped out of a gentle breeze. When he turned and smiled, she felt herself forget how to breathe for a moment. He said he guessed she liked latte and handed her the warm cup, adding that if he was wrong, he had a backup plan of black tea. Emily took the cup and smiled, telling him he was lucky to have guessed right. They began walking along the stone path that circled Zilker Park, the leaves beginning to turn gold, couples strolling with their dogs or reading quietly across the grass. Nate walked slowly, never rushing, glancing at her now and then as she talked about her early career, the rejected design boards, the sleepless nights spent finishing project drafts, just to earn a single approving nod from a client. He did not interrupt, only asking questions at the perfect moments, opening small doors in the conversation that made her want to keep speaking. At some point, Emily realized she was talking more than she usually did, laughing more, even sharing pieces of her private life she seldom revealed. When she told him about her parents in Colorado and how they still believed she should return to become an art teacher rather than draw kitchen layouts for wealthy clients, Nate nodded and said they loved her, but not everyone could see the fire she was chasing. His words silenced her for a long moment, not because she felt exposed, but because it was rare to be understood so deeply after only 2 meetings. From that afternoon on, they saw each other more often, with no schedule and no pattern. Sometimes it was a brief lunch at a small French bakery near her studio, where he stopped by just to give her a book on classical architecture he had found in an old shop. Sometimes it was an evening at a street art exhibition where they stood before a giant graffiti mural and debated whether it was rebellion or a cry for help. Sometimes he called her out of the office on a weary Thursday afternoon simply to sit quietly beside him on a park bench, saying little, letting the air speak for them. Emily did not know what was forming between them, but she knew it was not coincidence. Nate was not a man of randomness. Every appearance he made carried intention. Every word he spoke held weight. And what drew her to him was not his polished exterior or the confidence of a successful man, but the stillness underneath it all, as though beneath the immaculate surface lay something painfully real, easily wounded, and quietly dangerous. One Friday night, after a late dinner at a small Italian restaurant on South Lamar, they walked toward the parking lot. When they approached her car, Nate stopped and asked if he could ask her something. She agreed, puzzled, and he asked why she did not ask him more about himself. She answered instantly, telling him it was because he was not ready to share, and she did not want to damage something that was slowly becoming good. Nate looked at her for a long moment, as though measuring the depth of her trust, then nodded with a quiet weight and thanked her. She smiled, resting her hand on her car door but not opening it yet. Something between them had shifted gently, like a doorway opening without a sound. She wished him good night, and he did the same, standing there watching as she drove away, the red glow of her taillights flickering in his eyes like a small flame. When she reached home, her heart still had not settled into its rhythm. She did not know where she was heading, but she knew one thing clearly: she no longer wished to turn back. 3 days after that quiet evening outside the Italian restaurant, Emily received a message from Nate at 8 in the morning. No greeting, no emojis, only a short line that stirred something inside her. If she was not busy that night, he wanted to take her somewhere. Nothing formal, just a more private place. Emily took 10 minutes to reply, not because she hesitated, but because she wanted to make sure she did not respond too quickly. She wrote that she was free after 6 and asked him to send the address. He answered almost immediately with the address of a penthouse in downtown Austin. She had seen the building before through a project she once worked on, but never imagined she would step into one of the top-floor residences where windows stretched from ceiling to floor and people lived suspended above the city. When she stepped out of the elevator at 6:17 in the evening, the door was already ajar. Nate waited at the entrance wearing a gray rolled-sleeve shirt, barefoot, holding a glass of wine in one hand while the other rested casually in his pocket. He smiled at her as though they had known each other far longer than they had, as though her presence in his space was the most natural thing in the world. The apartment was wide, open, and minimalist, not the ornate, showy style common in the homes of men with his level of success. Everything was arranged with intention, but still carried the warmth of a place where someone actually lived. Emily looked around, unable to hide her quiet amazement. She asked if this was his home, and he nodded, setting his glass down and motioning her inside, telling her it was merely a temporary retreat, that he did not stay in one place for too long. She removed her shoes and stepped in, feeling as though she had crossed into a different world, one entirely separate from the noise of the streets below. They sat together on the wide balcony overlooking the Austin skyline, the twilight deepening as the city lights flickered awake. Nate poured her a glass of wine without asking whether she wanted one, and Emily did not object. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the evening breeze lifting strands of her hair, until he spoke in a low voice that sounded almost like a confession. He told her she deserved to know more about the man she was spending her time with. Emily turned toward him, saying nothing, waiting for him to continue. Nate set his glass down, laced his fingers, and kept his eyes on the horizon as he said he was not only in real estate, that the Romano Group was part of something larger, older, and far more complicated, that his family carried a history. Emily blinked, her mind connecting fragments of rumors and whispers she had heard before, the unclear origins of the corporation, the muted acknowledgments exchanged in investor circles. When she began to form the question, he nodded and finally looked straight at her, explaining that his grandfather had left Sicily after the war, bringing traditions and relationships with him, that his father had expanded them, and that he had inherited the rest. Part of that inheritance involved building legitimate business, but another part remained: roots that could not easily be uprooted. Emily felt her chest tighten, not from fear but from the sheer honesty of the admission, a truth laid bare with a weight she did not know where to place. When she asked what, exactly, she was sitting here with, Nate gently interrupted, telling her she was sitting with someone who had once been part of that world but was trying to step out of it. Slowly, not easily, but without hiding anything from her. She rose and walked toward the railing, gripping her glass, needing a few seconds to breathe. The night wind swept softly across her hair. She sensed him stand, but he did not move closer, did not apologize, did not try to soften anything. He simply let her think, and that made everything feel even more real. She asked whether he did anything dangerous, and he answered calmly that he never harmed women or children, never dealt in forbidden substances, never worked with men without principles, that there were boundaries and he had never crossed them. Emily turned back toward him, her eyes no longer frightened but unsettled, and he told her he knew this would give her pause, that he demanded nothing, only that she know the truth before they went any further. She looked at him, the man she had once thought was merely a private CEO, now revealed with a shadowed past told with disarming clarity, and she did not know whether she should run or stay, only that if this was real, he had chosen to say it. And in a world of pretense, truth, even unsettling truth, was its own invitation to trust. Emily drew a long breath, returned to her chair, set down her glass and told him softly that she needed time, but she was here, in this moment. Nate did not smile or show relief. He simply nodded once, and that quiet gesture carried its own profound weight, because both of them knew that his confession had changed everything. 2 weeks passed after that night when Nate sat beside her with steady eyes and a low voice, telling her a part of who he truly was. Emily did not run, but she did not surrender herself completely either. They continued to meet, to walk, to spend hours in a small cafe in Hyde Park, discussing the shape of a chandelier or an old photo book Nate had stumbled upon. Everything between them grew more cautious yet deeper. She never asked for more, and he never volunteered more. But Emily knew that every time he looked at her a few seconds longer or held her hand a little tighter while crossing the street, another piece of him was opening, little by little. She did not know whether what she was doing was right or wrong, but with every passing moment she felt herself moving closer to a place her rational mind could no longer control. And then, Vanessa appeared. They met on a Saturday afternoon, when Emily walked out of a client meeting and stopped by her usual flower shop on South Congress. She was choosing lavender when a woman's voice rose behind her, soft but clear, as though waiting for her. The woman stood before her, tall, early 30s, short dark hair, wearing a deep plum dress that clung to her figure, sharp and striking. She asked if she was Emily Sanders, introduced herself as Vanessa Clark, a name that meant nothing to Emily at first, though the woman's eyes sharpened her instincts. Vanessa said she knew Emily was seeing Nate Romano and that she was not there to start a scene, but to warn her before she went too far. Emily tightened her grip on the bouquet, keeping her voice steady as she said she did not know who Vanessa was, and that this was none of her business. Vanessa gave a small smile, not mocking, but reminiscent of someone who had already walked the path Emily was standing on. She said she was someone from Nate's past, not a fleeting lover, but someone who had been there when everything began, when the Romano group was clean on paper, but filthy behind the scenes. Emily wanted to walk away, but her feet felt anchored. Vanessa continued, her voice calm and unhurried, saying that Nate was charming, intelligent and skilled at making women feel chosen, but that his world was not as simple as he made it sound, that there were things Emily did not see, and that once she stepped in too deeply, She would not be able to step out. Emily swallowed, her throat tightening, telling Vanessa she was not blind. Vanessa agreed and told her she was not blind but naive, that she too once believed she understood Nate until she discovered she was being followed. Her phone tapped, her friends drifting away, and no exit she could find because everything was shielded by money and power. Emily clutched the lavender as though releasing her grip might scatter her doubts across the floor. She said she did not need anyone to teach her fear, and that she would know when to step back if something felt wrong. Vanessa was silent for a long moment before nodding, saying she hoped Emily was right, sincerely, but that if one day she realized she had sunk too deep, she should remember that Vanessa once stood exactly where she now stood, and it had taken her 3 years to pull herself out. Then she turned, walked past the tulips and disappeared through the shop's glass door, leaving Emily standing there with the lavender in her hand and her heart pounding in restless disorder. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, each word Vanessa had spoken settling in her mind like a grain of sand she could not shake loose. She had always known Nate was not simple, but she had not known that someone had once left him carrying that much fear and suspicion. She did not know whether Vanessa had been speaking out of genuine concern or out of the lingering bitterness of a failed relationship. The only thing she knew with certainty was that from this moment on, she could no longer look at Nate the way she had before. She began to question, and for her, that alone was the first crack. 2 days after meeting Vanessa, Emily still could not sort through the thoughts swirling in her mind. The warnings, the seasoned look in Vanessa's eyes, the cold tremor she felt at the mention of being watched, all circled inside her like a restless tide. She told no one, not even her closest friend, not even Ethan when he called to check on her. But the more she held silent, the heavier everything seemed to press against her chest. On Tuesday night, when Nate called and asked if she wanted to come over for dinner, she heard herself say yes before she had time to think. She needed to see him, not to confirm nor to end things, but to face what stood between them, to understand where she was in all this uncertainty. When she arrived, he had already prepared dinner, just pasta and a bottle of red wine. The lights were soft, the jazz playlist familiar, but the air felt different. Emily did not smile when she walked in. Nate noticed immediately, but he did not ask why. He poured wine, pulled out her chair, and simply said she seemed to be carrying something heavy. She sat, holding her glass for a long moment without drinking. Then she set it down, lifted her head and said quietly that she had met Vanessa. Silence filled the room for 3 seconds. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of someone who had expected this moment and hoped it would not come so soon. Nate did not look away as he asked if Vanessa had sought her out. Emily nodded and said it had been in the flower shop, that Vanessa had not threatened her, only told her stories. Nate rested his arms on the table, his fingers intertwined. When she asked whether he wanted her to believe Vanessa, she admitted she did not know, but she trusted her own intuition, and her intuition told her to ask him rather than run. Nate nodded slowly, his gaze unguarded now. He said Vanessa was part of a past he was not proud of, that when he met her, he had been deeply entrenched in things he could not yet control, and that it was true everything around him then had the potential to harm others. When she asked whether he knew Vanessa had been followed and isolated, he said he had known and had tried to stop it when he realized what was happening, but she had to understand he could not control everything, that he was not a mafia boss, but the heir to a network that required sacrifice to break away from. Emily was quiet for a long moment before asking whether he was sacrificing anything now. Nate answered without hesitation. He told her he was breaking ties every day, refusing opaque deals, building legitimate subsidiaries and doing none of it to be a hero, but because he wanted something genuine, a real life, with someone he did not have to hide from. She looked at him, confused, yet softened, knowing he was not crafting a story. Everything in his voice, in his eyes, was real. And that was what made it harder. If he had been cruel, walking away would have been easy. But because he was honest, she was forced to choose between fear and trust, between his past and a future she could not predict. She told him she could not promise she would never doubt, but she did not want to leave, not while she still believed in him and in the effort he was making. Nate exhaled softly, as though released from a windowless room. He extended his hand toward her, not touching, simply offering. Emily placed her hand in his, and in that moment neither of them spoke, because what they had just given each other required no words. It was trust, and if anything in this world could hold two people together despite every shadow behind them, it was that. A week after that defining conversation, with trust laid like the first stone of something deeper, Emily began noticing that Nate was changing the way he stepped into her life. He no longer invited her only to familiar cafes or quiet park walks. Each meeting now revealed a slightly wider glimpse of the world he lived in, as though he were gradually opening doors, testing whether she was steady enough to step farther inside. And then, on a Thursday night, while they had dinner at Emily's apartment, a simple meal she had cooked herself, Nate set down his glass, watched her for a long moment and said in his usual calm tone, though with a hint of caution, that there was an event he wanted to take her to. A gathering unlike anything she had ever attended. He told her it was not a corporate party or a charity gala, but a place where men like him connected with one another, a remaining piece of the old world he had not fully stepped out of, and that if she agreed to go, he would feel lighter because he did not want to keep her outside of anything. Emily set her utensils down, her eyes fixed on him, asking whether it was safe. Nate said it was safe if she stayed close to him, his voice steady enough for her to believe it. He told her the place might feel strange, perhaps uncomfortable, that the rules were different and the way people looked at one another was different, but no one would harm her, and he assured her of that. She exhaled, caught between fear and curiosity. She knew this was another turn in the path, another step deeper into the part of his life he kept hidden from the ordinary world. And if she refused, he would understand. But she no longer wished to stand outside. Not anymore. On Saturday at 8 in the evening, Nate arrived to pick her up in a familiar black unmarked car he used on discreet occasions. Emily wore a long black dress with a high neckline and an open back, simple yet elegant, without jewelry, only a deep red lipstick, a quiet declaration that she knew exactly where she was going. Nate looked at her as she stepped out, offering no compliment, no dramatic remark, only saying he was proud to walk beside her, and that single sentence stirred something deep inside her. They spoke little on the drive to the venue, an old mansion hidden in the woods on the western edge of the city, surrounded by tall iron gates and dense trees so thick nothing inside could be seen from the outside. When the car stopped, someone opened the door for them. No one asked their names. No invitation was required. Only a silent nod of recognition. Emily lightly took Nate's hand as they crossed the threshold. The interior glowed dimly with warm golden lights, furnished in classic style without feeling outdated. Men in dark suits and women dressed like they had stepped out of a 1940s film drifted through the rooms, their eyes sharp and cold, their smiles cautious and thin. No one laughed loudly. There was no pounding music, only a soft wash of jazz and quiet conversations threaded with hidden meanings. Nate kept her close, introducing her by her full name to a few people. No one asked more about her, yet Emily felt their eyes assessing her, as if she were an exam they were waiting to see her pass or fail. After a while, they sat on a second-floor balcony overlooking the garden where a few men smoked cigars and spoke in Italian. Nate poured her a glass of wine, And for the first time that evening, he looked tense. He told her he had not brought her there to impress anyone, but to show her the world he was slowly leaving behind, to prove he was not speaking in empty promises, and that if she ever chose to walk away, at least she would know why. Emily looked at him, seeing no shield in his expression, only a near-bare honesty of a man tired of holding his darkness alone. She placed her hand on his and lightly squeezed, telling him she would not leave because of his past, only if he tried to hide it. And now, she added, he was doing what no one else in that house dared, facing it. And that made her trust him even more. Nate did not respond with words. He only tightened his hand around hers. Outside, conversations continued. Wine glasses clinked. But for Emily, that moment marked a turning point. Because she had stepped into the shadows with him, and instead of fear, she felt more steady than ever. A week after the gathering, she quietly called her, a walk through the dark. Nate phoned her on a Tuesday morning. His voice was not quite tense, but deeper than usual. He told her there was a dinner that evening he wanted her to attend with him. Not an event or a party, but a family dinner. Emily repeated the word, surprised, and after a pause, Nate said his father was hosting a private dinner with uncles, cousins, and his grandfather. Emily exhaled slowly. She had never imagined she would meet the people who shared Nate's blood so soon, especially after learning what lay beneath the polished surface. But the look Nate had given her that night on the mansion balcony had made one thing clear. He no longer wanted to keep her outside the boundary. And if he was stepping out of the darkness, she would have to be steady enough to walk with him into the light of a world where greetings held 3 layers of meaning and a handshake could carry acceptance or challenge. That evening, Emily chose a midnight blue dress, not too revealing but refined enough to stand among the people bearing the Romano name. Nate picked her up in the same familiar car. On the drive, he said only once that his family would not trust her easily, but they would know she was not a trivial presence. And the rest, he said, stood with him. The house hosting the dinner sat in the northern suburbs, large and discreet like a fortress. Entering the marble foyer felt like stepping out of reality into a still portrait of old power. They were led into a long dining room where nearly 10 people were already seated. The men wore black suits, the women were impeccably made up, and no detail about Emily went unnoticed by their eyes. Nate pulled out her chair beside him. No one smiled. No one made small talk. Only quiet evaluation and unspoken questions filled the room. When the first course was served, an older man at the head of the table set down his glass and spoke. It was Nate's grandfather, Giovanni Romano, the figure spoken of as the living emblem of the family. His voice was deep and clear as he recited that she was the girl from Colorado, an interior designer who had once taken on a penthouse project without knowing who stood behind it. The room fell silent. Emily held his gaze, her posture straight. She replied that yes, that was her. And she believed she had done good work even without knowing who was behind the design. A woman to the right gave a small laugh, unclear whether respectful or mocking. Giovanni did not laugh. He nodded slightly, as though weighing a chess piece, then asked why she was still sitting there knowing the family was nothing like what she was accustomed to. Emily took a slow breath and answered that the person she chose was not a name, but a man trying to change. And if she fled only from fear of his past, then she might not be worthy of the future they were both trying to build. Her answer deepened the silence. Then Giovanni lifted his glass. He said he liked honesty, even if it was not always convenient. The other glasses rose gradually. Nate looked at her. His eyes touched with surprise and pride. The dinner continued with a silence that gradually softened into small questions and slow conversation. A cousin asked her about her preferred design style. An aunt recounted how Nate had abandoned piano lessons at 13 to chase architecture. And though no one asked directly about their relationship, the eyes around the table grew less cold, the voices less sharp. When the meal ended, Giovanni spoke again, saying she might never fully understand this world, but if she intended to walk beside Nate, she needed to know that this place did not accept outsiders easily, and that tonight she had passed the first test. Emily bowed her head in thanks, knowing that she had not simply shared a meal with a family. She had stepped into a system of rules, unspoken codes, and power that watched every detail. But she also knew she had not stepped into it alone. Nate waited at the door as she said her goodbyes, took her hand as they walked out and said nothing, and once they were in the car, he touched her hand with the faintest brush of his fingers and whispered that he had never brought anyone there before. Emily smiled and told him she knew, and that she had never imagined she would belong in a place like that. But if it was with him, perhaps she could learn to stay. After that night in his grandfather's mansion, everything between them shifted into a different phase. The tense dinners filled with scrutinizing glances were gone, as were the unspoken questions about class, fit, or legitimacy. She did not know whether she had been accepted, but what mattered was that Nate seemed lighter beside her. No longer guarded when speaking about his family, no longer hiding work calls, occasionally sharing pieces of his past he once protected like forbidden ground. They spent more time together, not through grand gestures, but through moments that felt startlingly real. One Saturday afternoon, Nate drove her out of the city, along winding oak-lined roads into the western Texas hills, the trunk packed with food he had prepared that morning. Grilled chicken sandwiches with Swiss cheese, fruit salad, walnut cookies, and 2 bottles of cold apple juice. Emily could not hide her surprise at the neat labels he had placed on each box, his eyes bright with a childlike delight as though he were heading into an adventure. They spread a blanket by a quiet lake with no one around, only birds and the whisper of wind through the branches. Emily lay back on the blanket with her eyes closed while Nate sat beside her, sketching the outline of a small hillside house. He said he imagined himself living somewhere like this one day, not to vanish, but to begin again, not as a Romano, but as himself. She looked at the sketch and then at him, telling him he did not need to start over, only continue with the version of himself he was becoming. Nate paused, looked at her for a long moment and nodded, telling her he had never thought he would meet someone who made him want to speak not to be forgiven, but to be understood. She smiled and touched the curve of his eyebrow, saying she had not come to fix him but to walk with him. In the days that followed, they led each other deeper into their private worlds. Emily introduced Nate to her parents over a slightly awkward FaceTime call. Mrs. Poss Sanders widened her eyes when she realized her daughter's boyfriend was the same Nate Romano she had seen in financial magazines, and Mr. Sanders asked only whether Nate intended to be serious with his daughter. When Nate replied that he never played with anything he was not willing to keep for the long run, the tension eased. A week later, they cleaned Emily's apartment together not to move, but because Nate said he wanted a small place within her world. Not much, just enough that he would not feel like a guest each time he stepped inside. Emily agreed, not because of his words, but because she had felt that truth in everything he had done for weeks. One rainy night, as they lay listening to the soft fall of rain against the window, Nate told her about his mother, the only woman in his world who had dared to defy his grandfather. She died when Nate was 15, leaving the Romano family filled with strong but silent men. He said he grew up with that absence and learned to live by hiding until she came along, and for the first time he realized being heard was more powerful than authority. Emily said nothing, only pulled his arm around her because his words required no reply, only presence, trust, and the steady rhythm of breathing beside someone you love. And so, in the warm Austin days, in the aimless walks, the mornings scented with coffee and quiet music, Emily and Nate did not need to define their relationship. They simply lived inside it, like a wordless piece of music filled with deep, soft notes and soaring moments neither of them had ever believed could be real. By late November, Austin had begun to turn cold, the wind carrying the scent of damp wood and dry leaves curling through the corners of the streets. Emily woke earlier than usual, brewed coffee, and stood by the window watching the sun edge up behind the bare branches. Nate was still asleep, his hand resting lightly against the pillow still warm beside him, his breathing steady and peaceful in a way that softened something deep inside her. It had been nearly 2 months since they met through a mistakenly sent email, and neither of them could have imagined how far that small error would carry them. Mornings like this were no longer rare because Nate spent most weekends at her apartment, or sometimes coaxed her back to his penthouse with the simple explanation that he could not sleep well without her beside him. They had never formally defined anything, never named what they were, never demanded anything rigid from one another. Yet everything between them flowed with a natural, unforced honesty that made Emily begin to wonder when the moment would come to stop and call someplace home. That afternoon, Nate took her to a property being renovated near Lake Travis, a place he said he wanted to reserve for a space meant for the two of them. At first, Emily thought it was a casual remark, until she saw the detailed blueprint pinned to a large board in the unfinished house. There was a small office with a wide morning window, an open Italian kitchen like the one she once described as the little dream of an amateur cook, and a tiny garden at the back, with ivy climbing the walls and white wooden benches. She did not need to ask. She knew every detail had come from those evenings when they sat together with wine, dreaming of houses that suited the two of them. Nate said very little, only handed her a sample key attached to a thin leather cord, telling her it did not have to be today or tomorrow, but that if one day she wanted to wake in a place they both called home, then here it was. Emily held the key, her fingers tightening as her heart quickened. Not because of the invitation, but because of the way he said it, without pressure, expectation, or command, simply as a door left open for her to choose whether to cross. That evening, as they sat together on her balcony wrapped in the cooling air and Nate draped her old Denver Years scarf over her shoulders, Emily turned to him and asked quietly but firmly whether, if she said yes, he would move into her small apartment before the Lake Travis house was finished. Nate tilted his head, amusement and surprise glinting in his eyes, saying he had expected her to demand he move the entire penthouse into her tiny home. She smiled and told him she needed only a few shirts, a pair of shoes, and the man who grumbled every morning that she made her coffee too strong. Nate laughed softly and kissed her forehead, promising he would begin the next morning but with one condition. She had to give him at least one drawer, and that drawer could not be next to the stack of table linens she had collected since her second year of college. Emily laughed, nodded, and rested her head on his shoulder, the night wind threading through the balcony rails, sending a slight shiver through her that vanished the moment Nate's arms wrapped around her, warm and certain as though the rest of the world no longer mattered. The next day, Nate arrived with 2 suitcases, a few small boxes, and an unframed canvas painting he said he wanted to hang in the living room. Emily gave him a drawer, part of a shoe rack, and half of the bathroom shelf. Her small, tidy apartment suddenly echoed with warmer laughter, sleepier mornings and evenings filled with overcooked pasta or wine not chilled in time, all imperfect, all real, all theirs. And when Emily woke in the middle of the night to see his familiar silhouette beside her, she understood that even though the house by Lake Travis was unfinished, a home had already taken shape, built from trust, choice, and an unspoken invitation to walk through life together. 3 weeks after Nate shifted part of his life into her apartment. Everything passed so gently that Emily sometimes caught herself wondering when she had grown so used to his presence in every corner, from the charcoal toothbrush in the bathroom to the half-open book by the bed, to the scent of morning coffee drifting from the kitchen without her touching the alarm. But that very sense of peace stirred a quiet worry in her, not because she doubted their relationship, but because her past had never allowed anything soft to exist without cost. One late night, after Nate had fallen asleep, Emily sat alone on the sofa wrapped in a thin blanket, watching the lights of the apartment building across the street shimmer through her window. Her phone screen showed an unread message from Ethan, the friend who had unknowingly been the beginning of that fateful email. He wrote that he was glad she had found someone, but she should remember she could choose to stop whenever she felt the path no longer belonged to her. Emily reread the message, not because she doubted Nate, but because she understood exactly what Ethan was naming. The quiet fear she herself had not yet spoken aloud, the fear of losing herself in a world that moved too fast, too large, too flawlessly around a man like Nate Romano. The next day, while walking with Nate through the familiar farmers market where they often chose fresh produce and debated which tomatoes were best for an Italian salad, Emily suddenly stopped in the middle of the bustling rows filled with laughter and live music. She looked at him, a little unsure, and asked quietly whether, if one day she no longer resembled the woman he first knew, if she changed in an effort to fit his world, he would recognize it. Nate frowned and studied her carefully, asking why she would even think that. She told him softly that she had once reshaped herself to keep a relationship alive, only to find when everything collapsed that she no longer knew who she was. Nate did not answer immediately. He set his shopping bag down, took her hand, and guided her away from the crowd to a small courtyard beside a cafe. He lowered his head to meet her eyes, his voice steady and low as he told her he did not choose her because she tried to resemble him, but because she was herself. The woman who accidentally typed an email to the wrong man but did not erase it. The woman who could stand before his entire family without faltering. The woman who made him want to slow his life down. If she ever felt she was losing that, she needed only to tell him, and he would be the one to remind her. Emily held his gaze for a long moment, a tightness swelling in her chest not from fear, but from the gratitude rising through her. She nodded, then allowed a small smile to appear, and told him she thought it was time to say yes. Nate raised a brow, asking yes to what, and she burst into laughter when she saw the startled look on his face as she answered that she meant yes to the invitation to live together. Nate pulled her into his arms as the soft music from the cafe drifted around them, and in that moment there was no hesitation, no distance, only a decision born from a trust that felt full and deliberate. Not because everything was perfect, but because they were both willing to nurture whatever imperfections came with real love. And Emily knew that this time she was not losing herself. She was finding herself again in the sincerity of the man beside her and in the heart that had learned how to open one more time. 3 months after that morning at the farmer's market when Emily surprised them both by saying yes, among the ripe tomatoes and the acoustic guitar coming from the cafe, her life with Nate had settled into a steady rhythm, but not a rigid or dull one. Rather a rhythm shaped by the hurried pace of their work, the spontaneity of overcooked dinners, and the constant, unconditional presence of the two of them together. Her small apartment gradually changed over time, not only because of Nate's belongings, but because the atmosphere itself had shifted. The once bare white walls now held more paintings, some chosen by Emily and others drawn from Nate's sketches, including one he made during their first picnic by the lake. The dining table held a set of teacups he brought back from a short trip to New York, and the bookshelf had become two halves, one of interior design volumes, the other of economics, modern philosophy, and detective novels. Every morning Emily woke first. She cherished the quiet as the first light of day touched the curtains, loved making coffee with just the right amount of milk the way Nate preferred, barely sweet but rich enough, and treasured most the moment he stepped out from the bedroom with his hair slightly tousled, kissed her shoulder, and murmured that he thought he was the one making the coffee that day, though he still drank all of it like a morning ritual. In the evenings, after they returned from work, she from her studio, he from the office or another long meeting, they rarely needed plans. Sometimes they cooked together, sometimes they lay on the couch watching an old movie, and sometimes they sat on the floor among scattered papers, each tending to their own tasks while their hands found each other in some small place, a reminder that they were moving through life, side by side. Nate changed. Not loudly or dramatically, but unmistakably. He spent more time on himself, read more, even returned to the piano he had abandoned at 13. He remained a Romano with a packed schedule and heavy phone calls, but at home he was a man who could apologize for burning toast, who could say she was right even when the argument was about forgotten laundry, and who knew how to make Emily feel like the center of the world he had chosen to rebuild from the beginning. Emily changed as well, not into someone else, but into a steadier version of herself. She began to believe she could love without losing her identity, could give without bracing for hurt. She worked more effectively, more creatively, and her clients noticed the difference in every project. One day, when a VIP client asked for her secret to always having such energy, Emily simply smiled and said she began each morning knowing she was truly loved. One rainy night, the two of them sat by the window listening to the sound of rain falling against the fogged glass. Nate held her hand without looking at her, speaking softly as he said he knew everything felt calm, and that sometimes such calm frightened people because it felt unreal. But he wanted her to know that if anything in this world was more real than what he felt each time he looked at her, he had never encountered it. Emily turned her head and leaned her shoulder against him without speaking, because she understood that love did not always require affirmation. There were seasons in which the greatest thing two people could give each other was steady presence, an always open hand, a gaze without judgment, and a home where one could return and shed every pressure, every label, every fear, and simply be oneself. And in a world rushing noisily outside, Emily understood one truth clearly. Life was not perfect, but when shared with the right person, that imperfection became something beautiful. One early afternoon in December, as Christmas lights were being strung along South Congress Avenue, Emily received a message from Ethan. He wrote that he would be in Austin that weekend and asked if she wanted to meet for coffee. She stared at the words, feeling something unfamiliar rising in her chest. It had been nearly half a year since the mistaken email that changed the course of her life, and just as long since she had last seen Ethan. The old friend who once offered advice and honest conversations had now become a reminder of a former version of herself and Emily before Nate. Before she understood what it meant to love in a way that allowed her to change while remaining wholly herself. They met at Joe's Coffee, their old haunt on South Congress, where she and Ethan once spent hours after classes discussing design dreams, future jobs, and dates that never materialized. Ethan looked just the same, with his gentle smile, eyes narrowing faintly when he grinned, his voice warm and even. He pulled out her chair the way he used to and ordered exactly the latte she liked, still remembering it perfectly. But once they sat down, beneath the small talk about work and the ways Austin was changing, Emily sensed an unnamed distance slowly forming. Not because Ethan had changed, but because she had. He told her she looked well in a way that suggested she no longer had to hold herself together alone, as though someone was finally giving her enough space to breathe without bracing. Emily laughed, surprised he could still read her so easily, simply saying, "Nate." Ethan nodded, saying he figured as much. Then he leaned back and looked out toward the street. telling her he remembered when she sent that mistaken email and that, for an entire week afterward, he wondered whether he should fly to Austin just to see if she would wait for him. She turned to him, seeing for the first time a hint of regret in his eyes, but she told him she had not waited. Not because she did not care for him, but because, when everything began with Nate, it felt unlike anything she had experienced. She did not need to explain herself, did not need to shrink to fit into someone else's life. She simply lived. Ethan grew quiet, and after a moment he exhaled slowly and said he understood, and that if Nate made her feel that way, then he was the man who should stay. There was no hurt in his voice, only acceptance. The kind that belonged to a man decent enough to know when to let go, not because affection had faded, but because he believed she deserved the best path ahead. Driving home, Emily found herself reflecting. Seeing Ethan felt like looking into a mirror from another time, a version of herself who relied on logic, plans, and safe emotional distance. But life with Nate was different. It pushed her beyond the comfort of predictability, forced her to stumble, learn trust all over again, and release control without losing herself. Two worlds, two rhythms, and two men who had touched her heart in different ways. Yet only one remained, the one who made her no longer want to be loved safely, but to be loved truthfully. When she arrived home, Nate was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, back turned, slicing lemons for their evening cocktail. She walked to him, wrapped her arms around him from behind, rested her head against his back, and whispered her thanks for arriving in her life at the moment she believed she had only one choice left. Nate did not turn. He only tightened his hold on her hand. Without asking anything, he understood she had closed one door to protect another one that was open and leading toward the future. 1 week after seeing Ethan again, just when Emily thought everything had settled into the gentlest rhythm since she and Nate began living together, a name she believed she had already left behind resurfaced. Sienna. The message arrived on a Monday morning while Emily was in a meeting with her design team. There was no detailed caption, only a link and a cryptic line saying she deserved to know more. Emily hesitated a few seconds before clicking, and in that moment, her heart tightened. The image that appeared was a grainy, distant photograph of Nate standing in front of an upscale restaurant in Houston, beside a woman with dark brown hair whose face was blurred, but whose gaze toward him carried an emotion the sender clearly intended Emily to notice. Below the photo were insinuations that Nate had never fully severed ties with the old circle, suggesting that the woman in the image was the one rumored to be the covert liaison for Romano Group in Houston. Sienna did not say it outright, but the implication was unmistakable. Emily sat frozen, the phone growing cold in her hand. That evening, when Nate came home, Emily did not confront him immediately. She watched him as though retracing every familiar detail, the way he hung his coat, set his keys on the shelf, asked what she wanted for dinner, as if searching for any sign of dishonesty. But nothing was different. He was still Nate, still placing both hands on her shoulders when he kissed her cheek, still reaching into the cabinet for a bottle of wine like every other Monday night. It was only when they sat down to dinner that Emily set her phone in the center of the table, the screen illuminated with the photo. Nate glanced at it, showing neither surprise nor avoidance. He set down his fork and knife, rested his forearms on the table, and looked directly at her. He asked if Sienna had reached out again. Emily nodded and said the woman wanted her to believe he was still hiding something. Nate exhaled and gave a small shake of his head. The woman in the photo, he explained, was Claire Morgan, the executive director of a new branch in Houston. She had once been a close friend of Sienna's but had walked away from that circle 3 years earlier when she realized things had gone too far. He said he and Claire had met only to finalize a contract, and that if Emily looked closely she would see the photo was taken from behind, exactly the kind of angle Sienna always used, capturing a moment and inflating it into a story. Emily remained quiet, not because she did not believe him, but because she was watching his reaction, studying the way he faced suspicion without rushing to defend himself. Nate told her he did not want her to constantly verify his words, but he would not blame her if she needed time. All she ever had to do was ask, and he would not hide the truth. That simple, steady assurance loosened the tightness coiled inside her chest. She lifted her glass, tapped it gently against his, and told him she did not doubt him. She only hated that someone else was trying to make her doubt. The next day, Emily sent Sienna a single message saying she knew exactly what the woman was trying to do, and that this time it would not work. No reply came, and Emily did not expect one, because she understood that people like Sienna did not seek answers. They sought instability. And when they could not break something built on real trust, they eventually retreated, like shadows dissolving when light is lit. That evening, when Nate wrapped his arms around her from behind, rested his chin on her shoulder, and whispered his thanks for not stepping back, Emily only smiled and tightened her hold. Because in the end, trust was not crafted from perfection, it was shaped by the moments when both chose to remain, even when there were reasons to leave. And this time, she chose to stay, not because she no longer felt fear, but because she knew the man beside her would never let her face that fear alone again. 3 weeks after her final confrontation with Sienna, when life seemed to return to its natural rhythm, Emily received an unexpected phone call from an unknown number in Miami. The man on the line had a warm, steady, professional voice and introduced himself as Lucas Bennett, the executive director of the luxury hotel chain Solstice Resort. He said he had followed her work over the past half year through various projects in Austin, especially the recent penthouse design in the Romano Tower, and wanted to invite her to Miami to present a concept for a new project, a 5-star hotel being built on Key Biscayne Beach, intended to become the next landmark destination of the American South. At first, Emily thought she had misheard. Solstice was the name she had dreamed of since college, a luxury brand known for minimalist yet daring aesthetics, where every detail was placed like a curated piece of art. She spent nearly 2 full days preparing her concept, selecting materials, arranging color palettes according to the natural light on Florida's coast, and crafting a meticulous 3-dimensional model down to the smallest corner. As always, Nate was the last person she allowed to see the presentation before sending it off. He sat with her late into the night, adjusting only one minor detail in the lighting of the lobby before telling her her ideas did not need to be grander. They only needed to be hers, and she should not try to become anyone else. The presentation took place on a soft, sunny morning in Miami. In a glass-walled conference room with more than 10 members of Solstice leadership, Emily stood before her model, remote in hand, and began to speak not just with data or color theory, but with genuine conviction in what she had created. She described how a guest would feel stepping into the open-air lobby and sensing the ocean breeze flow through the architectural frame, explained the interplay between deep wood tones and natural sunlight that would evoke warmth and understated elegance, and most importantly, she told a story. A story about a place meant not only for resting but for remembering, a place where every object held its own purpose, every wall breathed a touch of nature, and every open space existed so that people could pause, breathe, and feel they belonged. When she finished, the room was silent for a few seconds. Then Lucas smiled, nodded to those around him, and said they had heard many presentations before, but this was the first time someone had enabled them to imagine the soul of a hotel through each small detail. 3 days later, Emily received the confirmation email. She had been chosen as the interior designer for the entire Solstice Key Biscayne project. When the news reached her studio, the team erupted. Emily sat stunned before her screen for a long moment and then burst into tears, not for the glory but because every doubt she had ever carried about herself had now been answered by her own perseverance, by her steadiness, and above all, by the quiet trust she had held from the moment she began this journey. That evening, she and Nate celebrated with 2 glasses of champagne and a simple dinner at home. He did not say much, only lifted his glass and told her he had always believed she would succeed. But the most extraordinary part was that she had finally learned to believe in herself. Emily smiled, her eyes shining after such a long road, for in the end, what mattered was not only securing a major contract, but the journey that led her there, a journey where every step was laid with sincerity, every choice accompanied by trust, and every achievement built from the truest, most intimate parts of herself. And she knew then that this dream was no longer a dream at all. It was real, not just because she deserved it, but because she had never stopped moving forward. One gentle late spring afternoon, as Emily sat in her new office on the 6th floor of a glass building overlooking Lake Austin, she found herself reopening an old inbox. Between hundreds of work emails, meeting invitations, technical drawings, and supplier quotes, she stopped at a message with a simple subject line, "Finally coming to Austin." It had been sent nearly 1 year earlier. The words were still familiar, still brief, still a little rushed and filled with excitement. It was still an invitation to a quiet dinner, with sweet descriptions of the food, the warm lights, and a casual suggestion to stay the night. Even reading it again made her cheeks warm. Because that single mistaken click, one wrong name in her contacts had steered her toward the most unexpected turning point of her life. Not toward Ethan, the old friend from years ago, but toward Nate Romano, the powerful, enigmatic, and deeply sincere man who walked into her life without warning and chose to stay with every part of himself. Emily's life now was not a fairy tale. She still had long meetings, contracts that required negotiating every detail, and sleepless nights spent adjusting drawings. But within the rush of it all, one thing remained: constant love. Not loud, not showy, but steady, honest, and warm. Nate was still the one who woke later than she did every morning, yet always left coffee prepared for her the night before. He no longer interfered with her work, but he remained the first person to read every new design she created, his eyes lighting with the same enthusiasm he had from the beginning. And whenever Emily felt she was not good enough, not strong enough, not creative enough, he would say only one thing: "You were enough from the very first day." Looking back on the entire journey, Emily could not help but smile. If she had not sent that email to the wrong man, if Nate had not chosen to respond in such an unexpected way, if she had not stepped out of her comfort zone and allowed herself to trust something uncertain, would she be sitting here now, in a space that belonged entirely to her, at the heart of a dream project, and in the arms of a man who showed her that real love truly was possible? In the end, this story was not just a romance born from a small mistake. It was proof of something far more important: that the most beautiful things sometimes do not arrive according to plan. That every misstep, if we are brave enough to face it, can become the beginning of something extraordinary. And that life does not always require perfect certainty. Sometimes all it needs is a little trust, a little openness, and someone willing to walk beside us all the way to the end. If you have listened this far, perhaps your heart has stirred the way Emily's once did. So do not forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a heartfelt story each day. Please like and share this video with the people you love. And tell us, what are you feeling after hearing this story? Have you ever had a moment of fate that changed the direction of your life? Leave a comment below and share the truth from your heart. We would love to hear it. Thank you for journeying with us today. Wishing you good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days filled with everything you need. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.